What is happening, guys? Kadi Plays here, bringing you another Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel video. And in today's video, we're going to be doing a tier list for the upcoming Season 21 of Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel. So as I'm sure you're all aware, nice, we recently had a ban list that led to the banning of cards like Chairman's Merly, Block Dragon, and the limiting of cards like Branded Fusion, Grass, Jet, Swap Frog, so on and so forth. There's also some unlimits and semi-limits down here, as well as some other bans and limits that aren't, as important, but I probably could have listed them by the time I'm saying this now, so we're just going to forget that happened. But anyways, this ban list has been huge for the meta. As we've seen from, the most recent tier list, we're seeing, new stuff. And, this is the tier list from Master Duel meta, so it is focusing on, decks in tournaments, and it's compiling old data and new data and all this jazz. So this is not like a full comprehensive list of what the meta looks like, but we've seen since the tier ban, they've been dropping in power and other decks have been rising. So we can pretty confidently say that this ban list was, by all accounts, effective if you want to go about changing the game, right? So that's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about, I've got about 35 decks here. I think it might be 34, but we're going to say 35 just for simplicity's sake. I have 35 decks here that I'm going to talk about going into Season 21 and where I think they can be, where I think they're going to be at the start of the season. Now, some decks are going to be in this category right here, has potential. This category is honestly the most interesting in my opinion, because these are decks that I think if certain things kind of weed their way out of the meta or aren't as good as we think they're going to be, these decks could really do some damage on the ladder or in tournaments. So without further ado, I'm going to go and jump into this, not waste anyone else's time. We're going to jump into this tier list. We got 5 categories. We have tier 1, self-explanatory. These are the best decks in the game. These are decks that you're going to see a lot on ladder or in tournaments, and you have to prepare for them. You have to know how to play against them, and you might even have to put cards in your main deck to combat these decks. Tier 2 is pretty similar to Tier 1 since the meta is going to be quite concise in my opinion. I don't think there's going to be a huge power gap between Tier 1 and Tier 3. But what separates Tier 2 decks from Tier 1 decks and Tier 3 decks respectively is Tier 2, there are going to be decks that might have some consistency issues. They might have some ceiling power level issues. They might have some matchup issues compared to Tier 1, which is a little bit more well-rounded overall. Then Tier 3 is going to be slightly worse off than Tier 2, of course. These are decks that you might not prepare as much for because you don't see them very frequently, or because they have serious matchup issues or some serious consistency or, ceiling/floor issues. Has potential is exactly what it sounds like. These are decks that have some real potential in the meta if things go their way, right? So, spoiler alert, if Bystials aren't in the meta, there's going to be a lot of decks that are a lot better than they currently are, right? Then finally, we got UR/SR Dust. These are decks that you should probably dust, but maybe not because they might be good one day. Who knows? We'll see. These are basically just decks that are kind of dead in the water right now. And they might be dead in the water for a number of reasons, or they might just not be good anymore. I don't know, because something happened to them. So, anyways, first deck we're going to talk about is our first UR/SR Dust deck, and that's Emancipator. This deck is almost completely unplayable right now. It's not unplayable. You can still play and you can still combo off and you can still make a respectable inboard. But when you think about combo decks, there's no reason, in my opinion, to think about this over some of the other decks we're going to be looking at on the list. Because what this deck really had going for it was it had its FTK potential where you could just put up a board your opponent can't break without a card like Dark Ruler No More. But what it played so well into Bystials, it played so well into Tier Elements because it had the ability to play the Millers and the Shufflers and so on and so forth. Now, those cards are out of the tier is going to be less popular. The Shufflers and Millers are going to be less popular and powerful overall because there's just simply less of them. And also, we don't have Block Dragon, so this deck lost a lot of its recursion, it lost a lot of its extension, and it lost a lot of its level manipulation to be able to get exactly what levels you need to make the synchros that you need to make on your turn, which is quite unfortunate for the deck. One thing that is a shining light in the distance for Emancipator is Super Heavy Samurai. So, Super Heavy Samurai, for those of you who don't know, I'm not going to spend a bunch of time talking about it, but these cards, there's a lot of cards already in the game. There's a lot of cards that aren't in the game yet. All this stuff down here that is coming at some point. I don't know when. It might have been leaked, I'm not sure. But it is coming at some point, and when this stuff comes out, it is going to be, compatible, at least to a certain degree, with the Adamantipator cards, because it's more of like Earth Pile synergies. So you will be able to combine those decks. So there might be a reason not to dismantle this stuff. I'm personally not dismantling it. I know I have URS Ardust here, but I'm not dismantling it just because I might want to play with the super heavy samurai stuff. But as of now, it is virtually unplayable, at least in my opinion. So next deck is Adagnister. So Adagnister is going to be our first high potential deck. The reason this deck is high potential and not tier 3, at least in my opinion, is because of Bystials being in the format. If Bystials are in the format and they are prevalent, which we think they're going to be because Dragon Link has proven to be quite strong and virtually untouched by the ban list, Bystials are still going to be like pretty popular, and Bystials being popular doesn't flat out kill this deck like it kills another cyber strategy we're going to talk about in just a second, but it makes this deck harder to play than it really should be, right? It's an inconvenience for this deck, and that being in the format just makes it so this deck is just not as powerful as it could be. It doesn't have the same power levels it could be because there's just more counterplay to it, unfortunately. The other deck is Mathmech. So I'm going to put Mathmech at lower potential than Adagnister because it simply gets hurt more by Bystials. However, with that being said, Mathmech is, in my opinion, better than Adagnister if no Bystials are in the format. If no Bystials are in the format, this deck takes the cake over Adagnister because it combos easier, it combos more consistently, it's interrupted by less. It's just a little bit more well-rounded, at least in my opinion. I know there's a lot of Adagnister lovers out there, enjoyers out there, and I personally think this deck is very cool. I just don't think it's as good as pure Mathmech, right? And also, more than anything else, it's the hand traps. Mathmech can play 15 hand traps or 15 board breakers / going second cards, and Adagnister just doesn't have the same capacity to do that. They can play a lot, but they can't play the same amount as Mathmech, which is what I really think puts Mathmech over the top. It's one card combos that are backed up by one circular plus 4 hand traps is insane, right? Well, you might want a called by or a triple tactus in there or something like that, but you guys get my point. However, with all that rambling out of the way, I think Mathmech has a less potential than Adagnister simply because Bystials are not going to be completely out of the format. As long as Dragon Link and Branded exist, Bystials are going to be somewhere in the format, right? And that means that the decks that lose harder to Bystials are just going to have lower potential than decks that lose less to Bystials, right? The next deck is Branded. So this is going to be our first tiered deck, and that's going to be, jumping all over the place. We're going to do Branded at tier 2. So something about Branded is, I don't know how many of you guys know this, but for those of you who've watched my videos for a while, you know that I love Branded. It's one of my favorite decks, favorite archetypes ever created. I think the artwork is amazing. I think the way the cards function, how fluid the cards are, is amazing. I just love the play style of Branded. When you're not gimmick puppeting, locking people, English, nice. When you're not doing that, which is not really popular in Master Duel, it was popular in TCG and stuff like that, in Master Duel for a while. But when you're not doing that stuff, I think the deck is super cool. When you're doing that stuff, it's pretty toxic, but that's neither here nor there. Branded in its current, iteration it's honestly fine. One branded fusion doesn't really hurt that bad. It is kind of annoying to only have one branded fusion because if this gets banished off of a Runick spell, or if this gets banished off of a Kashtira, Diablosis, or an Ogre, or whatever it might be, it sucks. It's annoying. However, if it's not banished face down, you can still get it back with cards like Springin's Kit. Because Springin's Kit, for those of you who don't know, that's Super Heavy Samurai, hold on. Springin's, that's not how you spell Springin's. Springin's Kit reads, you can add one of your branded spell traps that is banished or in your deck or graveyard to your hand. So you can add your banished cards back from your banished pile to your hand. Now if they're face down, you can't do that. If they're face up from like Runick spells banishing them, you can do that, so there's a nice recursion there. Or if it gets DD Crowed or something like that. You also have Retribution to add, Branded Fusion back from the graveyard to the hand. So there's plenty of recursion, as well as strategy, of course. There's plenty of recursion for Branded Fusion, so it being at 1 is not a super big deal. But the better Cash gets, the more popular Cash gets, and the more Kashtira cards that come into the format, which they're going to be soon, the worse this is going to be. Also, it's important to note that Branded, it can technically play around Ash Blossom. There are people who are good enough with the deck to know how to navigate the deck properly to play around Ash Blossom as well as possible. But Ash Blossom, just across the board, is incredibly strong versus Branded. Cards like Dimensional Barrier are also incredibly strong versus Branded. Bestials are also fairly strong versus Branded. There's a lot of stuff that this deck struggles against that is popular. And all of this to be said is all of this is leading me to say that Branded is a deck that I personally don't think can ever be the best deck in a format. If it's going to be the best deck, a format like this is the format for it. Because the ceiling of the format just dropped tremendously with tier getting hit so hard. But despite all that, I don't think Branded has the ability to ever be the best deck in the format. If it ever is the best deck, it's just going to get countered really quickly. Within a week, people are going to be like, oh wait, Branded's the best deck. Let's just play all of our Branded counters, all the cards that are good versus Branded and are decent versus other matchups. And then Branded will fall back off, right? I think tier 2 is an appropriate place for it, but let me know in the comment section down below what you guys think. The next deck is Dark World, and I think this is another deck that has potential. I like Dark World a lot. I think it has a really high ceiling. You can do a lot with this deck. I think it's really funny that if someone max sees you, you can just deck them out, and that's actually a win condition. I think it's so funny that's the case. The fact that most of these cards don't say once per turn is absolutely absurd and probably should not be a thing, but it is. However, it does still lose to Maxi. If you're not able to deck your opponent out, it still does lose to Maxi. Nib is very good against it. Droll and Lockbird is very good against it. Droll and Lockbird is becoming more popular, at least in the tournament scene. Maybe not on ladder, it remains to be seen. But at least in the tournament scene, Droll is getting a lot more popular. It's very good against a deck like this. Bestials are also very solid against it. So overall, this deck has some potential, but I think it has a lot of pitfalls that's going to leave it in this has potential category, and I think it's just slightly worse than Mathmech. Not slightly, I think it's like a decent bit worse than Mathmech and Agnister. But yeah. The next 3 decks, I'm going to go ahead and talk about these all together. It's the Pendulum decks. I think all of these decks are above Dark World, but lower than the Cyberse decks as well, and they all have potential. I think the Draco Slayer has the most potential, then Endymion, then Pendulum Magicians. So all of these decks are incredibly powerful combo decks, obviously. Going first, these decks can absolutely just destroy worlds with what they can do combo-wise. However, they do struggle to go second. They struggle to play through interruptions because a lot of times you need so many combo pieces in your hand to make them function, which is why Draco Slayer, in my opinion, is the best one, because it combos the best off of like 1 or 2 cards, right? The reason these decks are just and has potential and not like potentially tier 3 decks is because of Kashtira, to be honest with you. Kashtira is not that strong, at least not yet. But Kashtira being as popular as it is on the ladder, and I'm sure you guys who play ladder know Kashtira is everywhere on ladder, right now at least. Kashtira just existing makes these decks so much more risky to play because they can just go Shangri-La and the rank 7 exceed that locks your zones. They just lock a Pendulum zone if they know you're playing Pendulums, right? And you're screwed. Like, what do? You have to out the Shangri-La, which is hard to do. It's just a hard card to out, and it's specifically hard for a deck like this, which has trouble playing through interruptions. So, because of Kashtira, these decks have potential. Because Kashtira is not like full power yet, these decks have potential is what I mean. But as soon as Kashtira becomes like full power and is like just full tier 1, which is probably going to be when all the Kashtira cards come out, these decks are probably going to fall down to this URSR dust category because they're just virtually unplayable, which is quite sad, right? Because Kashtira is going to be a very oppressive archetype. But right now they do have potential. Unfortunately, these decks also lose to Maxi very hard. They lose to cards like Duel and Lockbird. They can, for the most part, play around Nibiru, which is getting more popular, I should add. But they can struggle against Nib, right? They also struggle against, pretty much anything if it's going second. Like I already said, it's hard to go second with these decks, and it's hard to play around those really high-impact hand traps. The next deck is Drytron. I think Drytron is another one of these decks. There's a lot of these in a row, and I'm sorry about that. It's another deck that has potential. I think it's better than all 4 of these decks because it's more consistent, I think, than all of these decks. Dark World might be able to give it a run for its money on that, but I think Drytron is the most consistent of the 5 of these combo decks right here. But its problem is very similar to these decks, right? Bystials are a problem. Well, Bystials aren't a problem for this stuff, right? But Bystials are a problem for Drytron, of course. You know, it being all light is bad for them, and it's needing its graveyard, it's needing its Benton in the graveyard, it's needing, you know, targets for Ava. It needs its Drytron names, in the graveyard, so on and so forth. That sucks, playing against Bystials, right? So that alone makes this deck not super relevant, because as long as Bystials are in the format, this won't be in the format. Same thing with like Math Mech, right? And also, this deck loses really hard to Maxi, of course. It also loses very hard to Board Breakers, right? It also loses very hard to Duel and Lockbird. It can lose to Nibiru. It can also play through Nib fairly decently, but you know, Board Breakers, Droll, Nib, Maxi, all do kind of suck to see if you're playing Drytron, right? So, all in all, Drytron is super cool. I think if Bystials were completely out of the format, if all the Bystials magically got banned, I think Drytron would be like a tier 2, tier 3 deck. But that's not the world we live in, right? So, Drytron, high potential, has potential, but not enough to actually be tiered in the current format. Eldritch is the next deck, and this is actually probably the worst deck on this tier list. Like, there might be one other deck that's as bad as this, but I think this is probably the worst deck on the tier list. It's just completely outshined by all the other trap decks now, pretty much. At least in my opinion it is. And also, Bystials just run rampant over this deck. You have 2 to 3 Golden Lords in your deck. If let's say you're playing 3, if one of the 3 gets hit by a Bystial, okay, that sucks, but it's playable, right? If the second one gets hit, you're like, oh crap. If the third one gets hit, you're like, oh, how do I win? Or if you're only playing 2 and 1 Bystial gets hit, you're like, oh, okay, this is getting scary, right? And if the second one gets hit, like obviously, it's like, how do you win? This deck, like, I don't know how this deck wins against Bystials. That's the problem. Also, there are so many good trap decks now. I wouldn't say so many. There's a handful of good trap decks now that have traps that are more synergistic and more, recursive. Maybe not more recursive, but more well-rounded than Eldritch is. Also, all the floodgates being hit really hurts this deck because this deck plays the floodgates better than the other trap decks do, at least in my opinion, because this is the least monster-focused trap deck. Whereas the other trap decks, spoiler alert, they can play the floodgates, but they don't need to play the floodgates to win. Where Eldritch kind of needs the floodgates to win, which is kind of why Eldritch sucks, right? So yeah, I hope that all makes sense. Next up is Exosister. So Exosister, I'm going to say, is our first tier 3 deck. I think Exosister is really solid. Obviously, it plays Shifter, so out the gate, that's a check mark. It's really good. It can play Shifter. We're in a good spot, right? It can also play a lot of board breakers and hand traps. All right, check. That's another thing that's really important. It has a really, really, really strong first turn. The Exosister big, I forgot its name already. The big Magnifica? Yeah, Magnifica backed up by both traps. Like, very few decks can beat that. Whether you're a graveyard deck or not, very few decks can beat that. That is a very, very strong board. It's also incredibly consistent. It's got virtually no hits. Yeah, the pots are kind of hit, but who cares? It's virtually got no hits to it. I can play everything. I can play anything at once as far as like going second cards. And it's good into pretty much everything. It doesn't really have any bad matchups. You don't need your opponent to be graveyard centric for this deck to be good. That's just a benefit, right? Flundereeze, I think, is a worse version of Exosister, to be completely honest with you. I think this is just a slightly worse, maybe not slightly, maybe like a decent bit worse than Exosister, but still tier 3, because this deck, it still does the same crap it used to. Even with one imp in, it still does the same stuff. Shifter, obviously, check mark. All the hand traps, all the board breakers, whatever you want, check. The only problem is this deck just has been nuked into the ground by hits. But despite all that, it's still churning along. It's still playable, which is wild to me. But let's just take a look really quick. So we have map at 1, Impin at 1, Terraforming Band. All the pots hit because of this deck. Like, it's wild. Maybe not all of them hit because of this deck, but some of them hit because of this deck. It's consistent. It's less consistent in my opinion than Exosister, and it has a higher ceiling than Exosister because once the flu cards get going, they're some of the best engine ever printed. But it's got a lower floor too. So overall, I think Exo is just better. The next deck is like Kashtira. This is like Kashtira Control. I think this deck is like, I think it has high potential. I think it has like a decent bit of potential because it gatekeeps a lot of the meta. It gatekeeps a lot of this, like, it gatekeeps all of these decks. It actually gatekeeps a decent amount because, for one, it can play Shifter. It can also play, like, it can do the same stuff these decks can do. I think it just does it slightly worse because we don't have the full power yet. We're just missing so many cards from Kashtira, so it's less consistent, particularly than Exosister. It might be more consistent than Flu. I don't know. I haven't done the math on it, but I think Flu is probably still a little bit more consistent than this because if this deck doesn't open Fenrir or Unicorn, it kind of just sucks. And also I said Kashtira Control. This is not like the Kashtira combo deck that's making Tomahawk. That's this deck, and I'll go ahead and talk about it right after this, just for simplicity's sake. This is like the Kashtira Control, where you're going like Fenrir, you're going Shangri-La, Fenrir, Unicorn, and just controlling the board state with like controlling your opponent's board state. Not like going Wombo combo with Tomahawk. I think it is just a worse version of these two control/stun decks right now. Not bad, but not great. Will be great when we get the rest of the cards. The Tomahawk version of Kashtira, I think it's probably somewhere around here as far as like combo potential goes. Actually, no, it's probably higher. It's actually probably higher than these decks because it doesn't lose to the Bystials. So the issue is, the reason I think it might be, like, this is hard because I either think it's here behind Drytron or here ahead of, like, the other decks that lose to Bystials. I'm going to put it here because of how popular Bystials are. I think this deck not losing to Bystials is a really good thing for it. But it has the same flaws as decks like Drytron and Dark World outside of Bystials. It loses to Maxi, it loses to Nib, Droll's not too good against it. It's also super linear. Actually, it's kind of cool now because if you get impermed on the Tomahawk or Veilored on the Tomahawk, the deck doesn't do anything. However, if your opponent doesn't know what they're doing and they let you go Tomahawk, you then go into IP and then you go into Elf and then you go into Auroradon so that the Auroradon can't get stopped by a Veiler or Imperm because the Elf is protecting from targeting protection. If your opponent doesn't know what they're doing, this deck is a little difficult to interrupt. But if they know what they're doing, it's really easy to interrupt this deck, which makes it a lot worse. However, I think the fact that Imperm and Veiler are not the most popular hand traps is really good for this deck, and I think that means it's going to have slightly more potential than Drytron, at least in the current format. This might be complete copium. Let me know in the comment section down below how wrong I am on this, but I think my logic kind of makes sense. Less Imperm and Veiler, more Bystials means this deck is slightly better than like Drytron, right? Alright, we're going to roll with that. The next deck is Labyrinth. I think Labyrinth is our second tier 2 deck, and I actually think this deck is quite similar to Branded in the sense I don't know if Labyrinth can ever be the best deck in the format. It loses too hard to Ash, it loses too hard to, certain back row hate. It loses too hard to too much to ever, I think, be the best deck in the format. Because if it ever became the best deck in the format, people would be like, oh, let's just play Lab Hate and just beat this deck every time you play it. Right? Same thing with Branded, right? This deck also struggles a decent bit against the Bystials. If your Lovely gets hit, it really sucks. Let's go ahead and pull the Labyrinth cards up really quickly. Oh, that's not how you spell Labyrinth. That's Flow Lab. Okay, so the Labyrinth cards, if Master Meta is ever going to load, okay, this is not good. This is the time I wish I edited my videos, but I don't. That's quite unfortunate. Oh, okay, it was just not working for whatever reason. Whatever. Okay, so if a Bystial hits your Lovely Labyrinth, that sucks, because this is a 1-of. If it hits somehow both your ladies, that sucks. This is a 2-of. If it hits your Kuklok, that sucks. It's a 1-of. Bystials are solid against this. They're not great, but they're solid. One thing that's also important to note about this is Barkion is in the format. So if your opponent's playing Naturia Runick and they Barkion you turn 1 because they know you're playing Labyrinth, you literally have 1 out in your deck. You virtually have 1 out. And that's it's funny enough. I was playing Naturia Runick in a match, a war match over this past weekend, and I Barkioned my opponent in game 3, turn 1, because I went first, and he had the 1 possible out. There's more outs technically, but like 1 legitimate in-engine out to that setup, and that's get this into the graveyard. Have this in the graveyard. So like discard it with 1 of these, right? And then have this in your hand. So you dump the big welcome with 1 of the little guys, 1 of the little furniture cards, and then you Lady Labyrinth, summon onto the field, then use big welcome's effect in the graveyard to bounce the Barkion. That's one of the only legitimate in-engine outs to Barkion the deck has. That's just like an easy, efficient out to it. Sure, you could just like summon this, then like the next turn to attack and attack it, but this is like the most efficient, the best out to it. And the guy drew it, which is wild because it's a very hard thing to draw, but he did. So, well played to him. But this deck does struggle against Barkion. Like all my rambling aside, this deck struggles versus Barkion, and Barkion is pretty popular because Naturia Runick is very, very strong, as we'll talk about in a little bit. And also the Bystials are a problem. Ash Blossom is a very serious problem. Trap Hate is a serious problem. Red Reboot is kind of annoying to play against. Back row removal is annoying to play against. XYZ. For all those reasons, I don't think Lab can be the best deck, but I think it can be a very good deck just like Branded. So the next deck is Marincess. I think Marincess is top of has potential. Maybe even tier 3. Do I do it? I'm going to do it. Marincess, tier 3 deck. This might be copium. I'm gonna go ahead and go over, because I was gonna put these 2 decks together, Salad and Marincess. I'm gonna put them together because they're very similar, right, in like their power level and ceiling and stuff like that. So I'm just gonna put them together. They're also just Cyberse 1-card combo decks. Blah blah blah. Less so on Salad, but anyways, I think both these decks are like at the bottom of tier 3 or top of has potential. The reason being is because the way they combo, how they combo in so few cards means you have so much room for non-engine, hand traps, going second cards. Phenomenal. Salamangreat in particular, you can recycle cards like Ash Blossom, which is fantastic. Marincess, you just play all the hand traps. You just play all the board breakers. You just play whatever you want. It's fantastic. And it 1-card combos so efficiently. And also Zelantis is a crazy card. The recursion on these decks is phenomenal. The grind game is phenomenal. Their turn 1, their turn 2, it's all good. Salamangreat can OTK like crazy. Marincess has a harder time doing it, but it can still do it fine. They don't necessarily lose to Bystials. They don't lose to Bystials at all. They don't necessarily lose to hand traps. Maxi can be a little annoying. Nibiru can be a little annoying. But for the most part, they can play around hand traps very well and very efficiently, which is quite nice. So there's a lot going for these decks. They do lose to cards like Shifter, of course. They're not as strong. They don't have the same ceiling as like the top tier decks, but they're solid. They're solid choices, and I think you can easily get Master 1 with these. Very easily if you're, committed to it. The next deck in our first Tier 1 deck is Naturia Runick. I personally think this is one of, if not the best deck in the game currently. Obviously, as putting it in Tier 1 would indicate. This deck's phenomenal. It's got an amazing turn 1. You can end on full Runick cards, plus cards like Naturia Beast, Naturia Barkion, Baron de Fleur, Changing, whatever it is you want to end on, this deck can end on. It's so versatile. You can Trishula your opponent, which is wild. It's got a lot going for it. It's got an incredible grind game. The Naturia cards and the Runick cards are very good at grinding. The Naturia cards less so, but they're still really good at grinding games out. And overall, this deck doesn't have many weaknesses. It's very good into Max C. If your opponent Max C's you, you just set up Fountain, set up Mole Cricket, set up Camula, whatever it is, pass. Right? Easy. If your opponent Max C, if you go Runick spell to summon Hugin, they Max C you, you're like, okay, give them one draw off the Hugin, set up your Fountain, normal summon your Camula, send your Mole Cricket, you're good to go. You're chilling. Right? Or you just normal summon your Mole Cricket, pass the turn. You're good to go. It's the legitimate end board, which is wild to think about. It's also pretty good against Droll. Nibiru virtually does nothing versus it because you set up monster negates. And also nibbing a Runick field. That's funny. Right? It doesn't really do much because the deck just comes back. There's really very few downsides to this deck. It's really solid. I've been playing it a lot, and I can say from experience, it is very, very fun to play. It's also very strong. And I think it's probably the best deck, if not the second best deck in the format. The next deck is this is like Chaos Piles. Yeah, whatever. Just like Chaos Piles. I think it's just right here and has potential. I think it's like Punk Chaos Thunder Dragon Piles, like whatever it is, right? The deck that plays all the Bystials, all the Punk cards, all the Thunder Dragons, stuff like that. This deck is great. Its biggest weakness is Maxi, of course. Nib can be a problem. Droll can be a problem, of course. Bystials can be a little frustrating on your Chaos Ruler. It's kind of like these other light and dark combo decks. With Bystials, filter out of the format, they'll be a lot better. But until then, they're just gonna be having high potential, and they can catch you slipping. If you're playing Naturia Runick, you're not playing any Bystials. You don't open any of your hand traps because you're not playing very many. Your opponent goes full Chaos combo on you, you're screwed, right? But they're kind of just like glass cannon decks. That might be a better way to describe them. They're just very glass cannony. So they have high potential, but they're not the best decks. This is Punk, so this is going to be more of a pure Punk variant. When I say pure, I mean the 40 card versions where you're playing the Punk cards, maybe some cash cards, maybe some Bystials, however you want to build your deck. I think this is a tier 3 deck. It's phenomenal because it can play mid-range. It doesn't need to play combo. You can go just Bystial control. You can go Kashtira control. You can go Punk, set up an interruption, kind of control the board state with hand traps, control kind of deck. You don't need to play into Max C like these other decks do. It doesn't lose to Droll as much. It doesn't lose to Nib as much. It really doesn't lose to Bystials, depending on the variant. It's solid. I mean, there's really nothing to complain about with this deck. It's a good mid-range / combo deck in the format. It's not oppressive, though, so it's not the best one, but it's a solid one. And I think it's slightly better than a deck like Exosister because it has a higher ceiling. Yeah. The next deck is Rika, and this is going to be our our third Tier 2 strategy. I think Rika is slightly better than Branded, but slightly worse than Labyrinth, because Labyrinth is just really, really solid. Labyrinth is really solid across the board. It doesn't lose to cards like Max C, which makes it really strong. I should have noted that earlier when I was talking about it. But it being able to play around Max C is a really big benefit, of course, and Nib as well. Rika does struggle against Max C, kinda. It can struggle against Nib, it can struggle against Droll. It's really good into Bystials, which is a really good thing. But also, something that people don't respect about this deck is I just said it can struggle versus Max C. It does not always. If you have proper hand, this is important because you have to draw certain combinations of cards. You have to draw your Rika cards. If you draw your Rika cards, this deck doesn't lose to Max C because you just shift to playing like Con Control with Princess, with Sheet, with Con, so on and so forth. You just play Con Control, and that's really hard to beat, especially if it's backed up by a Maxi of your own, or a Nibiru of your own, or a Droll Lockbird, or some hand traps, whatever it might be. It's really hard to beat that, especially depending on the matchup, right? If you're playing like a Dragon Link deck and your Bystials are not proactive on your opponent's cards, they're more reactive and they have to be used on your own cards, this deck can kind of tear that apart. I don't think people respect Rika nearly enough. I've seen tier lists putting this like really low on the list and saying, oh, it loses to Max C, blah, blah, blah. It doesn't just straight up lose to Max C. This is a legitimate deck, and it's a deck that people do not respect at all. And I'm telling you guys now, respect this deck or you will lose to it. It is becoming very popular on ladder because people are starting to realize that this deck is good. So anyways, that's enough. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. I also don't play Rika, so this is not like a shameless plug, like saying like, oh, I play Rika, so it's good. I've never played this deck before. Actually, that's not true. I've played it before, but I don't play the deck. But I do think it's really good, and I have a lot of respect for it. The next deck is like Runick Stun. Yeah, screw this deck. This deck sucks. You know what? It's down here. This deck is a waste of time. Don't play this deck. It is not good. The reason this deck is not good is because it doesn't have like the fail-safe, the fallback plan of decks like Runick Naturia, Runick Sprite, Runick Furhire, Spoiler, which are also on this tier list, as you can probably see down here. The reason this deck is worse, just virtually unplayable, is because of all the hits to it, for one. And also, if your opponent uses their resources to out your Runick cards, what do? Right? What do? If your opponent outs your Naturia cards in Naturia Runick, you still have your Runick cards. If they out your Runick cards, you still have your Naturia cards. If they out your Furhire cards in this version down here, you still have your Runick cards. So on and so forth. You get my point, right? This deck is way too linear and way too just like, I have one plan and I'm going to do that plan no matter what. Those decks, that results in this deck not being very good. Because we're talking about it, I'll go ahead and talk about Furhire. Runick Furhire. Sorry, this picture's a little janky. Whatever. Runick Furhire, I think, is our second tier 1 deck. I think it's slightly worse than Naturia Runick for two reasons. One, Maxi hurts it more. You're required to summon more to get your combo going, and Droll hurts it more. Those are the only two reasons. The edge, I think, this deck and Runick Sprite, which is also tier 1, has over Naturia Runick is the fact that Hugin is a level 2, and it synergizes so seamlessly and so beautifully with the Sprite cards, and with Rex, of course. That's not to say Naturia cards don't synergize well with Hugin and Gary. They do. It's great having those levels to synchro, those levels to exceed, whatever, right? But having Hugin being a level 2, you can just go Hugin, blue, jet, starter, red, carrot, whatever, right? Go into gigantic. It's beautiful. It's so fluid, and it makes the deck so synergistic that is something that Naturia Runick just doesn't have. Naturia Runick has to combo in different ways. It's got to rely more on drawing, a few Runick cards and a few Naturia cards, right? Whereas Furhire or Sprite, more so the Sprite version, can just draw more Runicks, one Sprite card, and you're chilling, right? You're having a field day with that. I also think Runick Furhire in particular has the highest ceiling of the three. The ability to just draw 6 per turn is absurd. You can draw more than that, but drawing 6 per turn on your opponent's turn and your turn is quite absurd. Also, when this deck gets going, I think it's the best one. If you're able to combo without Maxi, without Droll interrupting you, this deck is the best in my opinion. But because those two cards are very popular and very strong, I think Naturia slightly edges it out. Runick Sprite, I think, is the worst of the three. Not that it's bad, it's still a tier 1 deck. Like, oh my gosh, it's only tier 1, right? It doesn't have the same ceiling as the Furhire. It does have a lower floor, though, because the Sprite cards, you're able to play like more synergistic cards than the Furhires. If you don't get Rex going early, if you don't like see Rex early, this deck is worse than this. But if you do see Rex, this deck is clearly better, in my opinion. The reason like this has a shot to be better than this in some games is because you can play cards like Hyperia, cards like Capshell, cards like Wind Up Kitten that are just like really good to summon off Gigantic, where Rex is not exactly the best to summon off Gigantic because you're kind of locked into your level 2 combos. And you can't go for your full go play. But yeah, I don't know. I'm kind of rambling at this point. I think pure Runick Sprite, regular Runick Sprite has a lower floor, a higher floor I should say, and a lower ceiling than Furhire Runick. So it kind of depends on playstyle. What do you want here? They all do different things, right? Naturia Runick plays the best into hand traps. Furhire's got the highest potential. Runick Sprite, it's like lower potential, higher floor, very synergistic, very consistent, but does lose to those hand traps still. So it's like pick your poison, right? Which one do you want? Like they're all good, they're all great. You can't go wrong with any of them. So yeah, I'm just making a mess of this now. So we're gonna go on to the next deck, but these decks are all very good. Dragon Link. I think Dragon Link is tier 1, and I don't really know where. To be honest with you, because you could make an argument that it's anywhere on this. I don't think it's the best deck in the game. I think Naturia Runick's the best deck. I think Naturia Runick and Furhire Runick are the 2 best decks. Then this deck is either here or here. I'm going to put it here just for diversity's sake. I don't think Dragon Link can ever be the best deck in the game for similar reasons to Branded and Lab. There's too much counterplay. There's just simply too much counterplay to these decks. This deck, if this deck is the best deck in the game, play Droll and Lockbird. Play Nibiru. You're going to destroy this deck. Right? Technically, as a Dragon Link player, I've played Dragon Link a lot in my life. It's one of my favorite decks ever. You can play around Nib decently. You can't really play around Droll. You can kind of play around Droll if you're making a conscious effort of it, but you're going to get hit by Droll at some point, and it's going to suck. It's just going to suck. That's just how it is. Same with Maxi. Maxi and Droll are just phenomenal against this. Bystials are solid against it. Nib is solid against it. That's kind of why I think this deck is the best deck, because it just plays around hand traps so well, right? Also, board breakers are quite annoying. You know, if your opponent super polys you, your opponent Dark Ruler no mores you, it's kind of annoying. There is counterplay to that, but it's still kind of annoying. But yeah, overall, Dragon Link is phenomenal. Like, I'm saying all the negatives. This deck is phenomenal, though. It combos off 1 or 2 cards very consistently. You can play a lot of non-engine, a lot of hand traps, a lot of board breakers. A lot of its engine, the Bystials, are hand traps, which is absurd. It's a phenomenal deck. It's one of the best decks in the game. As you guys probably saw from like the most recent Master Duel meta tournament, like the most recent one that happened this past weekend, there was 5 Dragon Links in top 16. That's absurd. It didn't win. Thunder Dragons won, but it's kind of like a Dragons variant, right? It was everywhere in this tournament. Absolutely absurd. It's clearly one of the best decks in the game. I personally just don't think it can be the best deck in the game because of its pitfalls. The next deck is Tri-Sprite, and sorry, these dual images, some of these dual images I made are janky, but that's okay. Tri-Sprite, I think Tri-Sprite's probably the best non-Runick Sprite variation in the game. Spoiler alert, I think Pure Sprite is slightly worse, but still very good. Tri-Sprite, the reason I think Tri-Sprite's better than Pure Sprite is because now it has the best inboard potential, and it's no less consistent than regular Sprite. Not really. I mean, maybe a little bit less consistent, but not that less consistent. These decks are both great. They can both play a lot of non-engine. They can both play a lot of hand traps. They're solid going second. They're not great going second. You have to draw your non-engine for these decks to be good going second, but they can still play. They can play around most hand traps pretty well. Maxi does suck, of course, but Maxi sucks for a lot of things. I think it can play less well into Maxi than decks like Rika can. So yeah, also, I should probably address this. I'll go ahead and finish talking about Sprite, then I'll address something I just said. These decks play less well into Maxi than decks like Rika do. So overall, I don't know. I mean, I think they're great. I don't think they're the best, but I think they're really solid choices. I think Tri-Sprite is really, really cool. I think its inboard is insane. It also just, another problem with Sprite is that they're so little. Like, the monsters are all so little. You just have problems outing boards just with your engine. A lot of times what it comes down to is going second, can you make Zeus? And if you can't, you lose. If you can, you got a shot. Which, I don't love that about a deck. I like decks that can play better into boards than Sprite can. For me, which is why these are kind of lower on the tier list. There's a lower tier 2. Not to say they're bad, of course. They're still phenomenal decks at tier 2. But that's kind of where I'm at with Sprite. So, I want to address something really quickly. I was talking about how this deck can play around Max C very well. Pretty well, if you draw the Rika cards. And I was talking about how this deck, Dragon Link, loses to Max C. Why is Dragon Link better than Rika? I don't think the gap is that wide. I think Rika, Labyrinth, Branded, all these decks are borderline tier 1. These decks are like tier 1, top of tier 2. I think these decks are clearly tier 1. I think these decks are maybe tier 1 decks, but definitely tier 2 decks. But why do I think Dragon Link is overall better than Rika? The reason being is because even though this deck does lose to Max C, kind of, you can still play under Max C. Seals Pass, or Seals plus Beast, Seals plus Regained, Seals plus Bestials is still really, really solid. It can kind of do that more consistently than Rika can play around Max C. Rika needs to open its Rika cards to be able to play around Max C. It needs to be able to open access to Con to be able to play around Max C efficiently. Whereas Dragon's, its entire engine can still end on a competent inboard versus Max C. So, for that reason, I think it's slightly better than Rika. Just, that's pretty much it. But I don't think Rika's bad by any stretch. I think these decks, like Labyrinth and Rika particularly, are borderline tier 1. So the next deck is Striker. I think Striker overall is probably better than these combo decks because it can go second. It chooses to go second. It forces your opponent's hand to go second. But it's still not good because of Bestials. Bestials are really annoying, but if you're playing against non-Bestial decks, like this deck is solid. I mean, Striker's great. I think Striker's really, really good. I think it's in a pretty good spot. I just think Bestials kind of just destroy it. So, sad, but it is what it is. Spiral. So, where is Spiral? I think Spiral is probably the best of the Loses to Bestials combo deck in the game. Probably. Yeah, we're going to go with this. The reason being is because Spiral can play through Bestials better than decks like Drytron can. At least I feel like. It might not be as good as the Punk Bestial deck. I don't know. These decks are probably like around the same area. But overall, I think Spiral might be a little bit better because the Kashtira cards are phenomenal. You play those now. The danger cards are a little whack because of Max C. But anyways, Spiral can play through boards very well. Whereas this deck struggles a little bit to play through boards. I think Spiral plays going second better than the Chaos Pile deck does. Not that Chaos Pile doesn't play through it fine. It can play going second decently. But I think Spiral's a little bit better because its engine is so just like... It just generates so many cards and it has so much recursion that Spiral's got a lot of potential going second. One Bestial can just FTK this deck, which is kind of funny, but it's also kind of sad. But it's getting better. The Kashtira cards really help this. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, there's really not much to say about Spiral. I mean, it's a combo deck. It loses to Maxi, it loses to Droll, it loses to Nib, and it doesn't lose to Nib as much as the other ones, but it can play around Nib decently, but Nib can't hurt it. It can really hinder its inboard. Bestials suck. The same crap I've been saying for all these other combo decks. We're going to move on. Sword Soul. Where is Sword Soul? I think Sword Soul is probably here or here. It's right there with Rika as borderline tier 1. I think it's slightly better than Rika. You could really also call this like tier 1.5 if we wanted, but I don't like doing that. We're just going to call it tier 2. I think Sword Soul's slightly better than Rika, slightly worse than Lab. Is it slightly worse than Lab, though? Or is it better than Lab? It might be better than Lab. The reason I'm thinking it's better than Labyrinth is because It can go first or second so well. It can out-trap. It plays really well into trap cards. It plays really well into pretty much any board. It can FTK almost all of these decks with Protos. If you know what you're playing against, of course. Obviously, just flat out FTKs this. Not really this. A lot of this stuff just gets flat out FTK'd by Protos. And if you know what you're playing, you can call Earth. You can call... There's a lot of stuff in this deck. That's the problem, is like with Rika, you can call Earth, I think. You can call Water. Oh no, you gotta call Water. Yeah, you definitely call Water. Yeah, you're gonna have to call Water, which you can do. You can do pretty easily. But yeah, you might also want to call Earth. I don't know. You either call Earth or Water with Protos, which are both doable against Rika, and you can really hinder them. Probably Earth. You probably call Earth just to stop their Loki combo. And then interrupt the Rika cards with your other stuff. So Sword Soul is fantastic. Sword Soul is super good. Honestly, does not get the representation it deserves. It's really strong. Protos is a hell of a card. Going second, it's a hell of a deck. It's great. We're going to talk about tier last. Trap Tricks. I think Trap Tricks is a solid control deck. I think it's probably around the same place as Kashtira Control right now. It's a good trap deck. It's just a worse version of Labyrinth. Like, it's a worse trap deck than Labyrinth and Exorcist. Exorcist is not really a trap deck. I mean, it's just a worse version of Labyrinth, really. Like, it's solid. If you want to play it, if you like it, if you like the little anime plant girls, then go for it. That's a weird statement. If you like them, yeah, this is a weird statement. But if you like those cards, play them. If not, just play the anime ghost chicks, right? We're chilling. Yeah, not too much to say about that. Trap Brigade Leerlusk. I think this is probably the best pure combo deck in the format. Probably. Which puts it about here on the tier list. I think it's probably the best pure combo deck in the format. It loses to no Bystials, doesn't lose to Bystials. It's hyper consistent. It can play at 40. It can play through Nib. It cannot play through Droll. It cannot play through Maxi. It can play going second much better than a deck like this Kashtira deck can, or a lot of these other decks can, because of Nibiru. Nibiru is really efficient in this deck. You can make Nib really easily with the Nightingale, with the Assembled, I think it's Assembled. Yeah, it's Assembled Nightingale. You can make it very easily and just nib your opponent, make a 6-mat nib very efficiently. It's solid. It does have some decent counterplay though. You know, Shifter really hurts it. Nib really hurt. Well, Nib can hurt it. Nib can really hinder its inboard. Kind of. That's actually, it depends on the opening hand. If you open like a Warbler hand, Nib is not the best because it really only stops the UDF. But even then, like, it's still solid. If you open like more like lower power hands, Nib can be really good against it. Droll obviously destroys it. Maxi obviously destroys it. Said enough. Moving on. Branded tier. So spoiler alert, I think this is the best way to play tier right now. I don't know if it's going to be like the best way to play tier in the long run, but right now I think it's the best way to play tier. But where do I think where it's at is the question. I think it's pretty bad, frankly. I think it's not bad, but I don't think it's like that great. I think it's, and when I say branded tier, I mean like Tierlaments with like branded Fusion and Cartesia and maybe an Alibur, Albaz, whatever. Like a more Tierlaments focused version or a branded version with some tier cards. Either one, just insert it here. I think they're about the same place. They're very different decks. I probably should have done this differently. They're pretty different decks, but they're about the same power level, so I'm just going to lump them into the same category and you figure it out for yourself. Yeah, anyways. It's okay. I don't know. I think it's the best way to play Tierlaments. It's not the best way to play branded. If you're playing like branded cards with some tier cards, just play pure branded, man. It's better. You want your extra deck space anyways, right? Just put more super poly targets in there. If you're playing tier limits with some branded cards, I think it's the best way to play tier. I've said that like 14 times already, so I'm sorry about that. And I think it's probably slightly better than the Princess and Salamangreat decks. I don't know, guys. It's bad. It loses. Bystials just destroy it. Bystials are just so good against it. And it's so depressing to watch tier play now. Spoiler alert, it's bad. It's really bad. So I think it might be tier 3, but it's probably not. It's probably worse than this, but I'm just going to put it here for whatever reason. Pure tier. This is pure tier limits. This is, you're playing 3 Rhinos, you're 2 Sharons, 2 Havnus, no Merleys because it's banned for whatever reason. Obviously, it's banned for a reason. It should be banned. Like, now that it's sunken in and I've been playing like this last season, season 20, and people are still playing like Merley and stuff on ladder, I'm sitting there thinking, I'm so glad you're banned. Because it's so stupid. Like, the deck's really fun. It's really cool to play. It's cool to play against sometimes. The deck is like beautiful to watch play. But it's so toxic when they just get like the luckiest mill ever. But pure tier in its current iteration, this deck sucks. This deck is absolutely unplayable. And anyone who's trying to cope and say that it's not, they're coping. I promise you they're coping. It is not good. It is not good at all. I've tested it. I've watched it play a lot. It is not good. 2 tier names is not enough. The deck does not do anything. It ends on Rukalos. And maybe a Soliak. Maybe. Nothing else. Literally nothing else. The deck's not good. It's just not. It hurts so much not having access to Sprint. It hurts so much not having access to Elf. Not having access to Baron now, because you can't play Diviner because you don't have Elf. You really don't have access to Garua plus Beatrice lines because you don't have your 3rd fusion. You really don't have access to Dragos Depalia lines, Kaleido Heart lines on your turn. It's bad. It's really, really bad. The way to play this deck might be going Kit, searching Soliak, pass. That might be the best way to play it. Because going for Rukalos is not it. It's really, really rough, guys. And I'm sorry if you're a tier lover. I like tier a lot too. I think the tier deck's really fun to play. It is really toxic. I've already said that, but it's really toxic. If you're a tier lover and you think I'm wrong, tell me why in the comment section down below. But yeah, anyways, that's going to do it for the tier list. I'm ready to get roasted in the comment section down below. So yeah, let me have it. But anyways, and all jokes aside, thank you guys so much for tuning in the video. Yeah, like all jokes aside, seriously, let me know in the comment section down below what you think of this tier list, what you think I got right, what you think I got wrong, and as well as like what other videos you'd like to see in the future. So yeah, thank you guys so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a great rest of your day. Peace.